What's good, YouTube? With the Dragonflight expansion just around the corner, I see people asking everywhere, what is the best class? So in today's video, I've done my best to try and answer that very question. We're going to go with the top 3 classes for Dragonflight, in my opinion. Right before we dive in, 94% of you guys aren't subscribed to the channel, but the more I remind you, the more of you sub. So if you're enjoying the content, drop your boy a sub. We're going to be dropping Dragonflight content every single day, but let's get back on with the video. So let's crack on then. Coming in at 3rd place, in my opinion, is the new Evoker class. Evoker is obviously a brand new hero class as we come into Dragonflight, which will be a nice breath of fresh air for some of you if you're bored of your 10-year-old main and feel the need to switch up. Being the new class in the game obviously brings massive attention as it always shakes up people's ideas with what to play, as the last time we actually experienced this was back in Legion when the Demon Hunter was first introduced, and that was back in 2016, so it's been a long time. Evokers have definitely earned their spot on this list, obviously receiving multiple changes from Blizzard recently, which is as expected with a new class, but Evokers are finally feeling in a great spot. They're very fun to play. They brought unique mechanics to the game in the form of charging up their abilities. They have incredible mobility with abilities like Hover, allowing you to cast on the move, and they're an absolute utility powerhouse. This is through the likes of bringing big movement bonuses to your party with their class buff, mass roots, AoE stuns, off heals or off damage depending on what your main spec is. The preservation evokers are definitely pumping some insane damage numbers as well, so don't be fooled by that. And massive AoE damage reductions through abilities like Zephyr. They're also one of the few classes with a lust ability, which is a huge reason to be brought to any type of content. Devastation, the DPS spec of the evoker, focuses on using the power of the red and blue Dragonflight, more so specializing in one to take down their enemies. The blue side of the talent tree focuses more on a single target build with abilities like Shattering Star, increasing damage enemies take from you by 20%, but you can actually amplify these abilities through different talents so that they actually hit more mobs. Therefore, obviously the red side of the talent tree is much more AoE focused, with abilities like Firestorm, bombarding enemies in a targeted area with big fire damage. Fear not, you can obviously mix and match these talents to pick up the best of both worlds, allowing you to perform in any type of fight you find yourself in. Devastation evokers also have their Deep Breath ability, flying up in the air and zooming over foes in a targeted area and dealing massive AoE damage, which can also be talented into a stun for 3 seconds. On the other hand, Preservation evokers, the healing spec of evokers, will channel the power of the green and bronze Dragonflight to aid their allies with big heals. The bronze side of the talent tree focuses more on heals over time or damage reduction over time for your teammates, whereas the green side of the tree focuses much more on direct heals like the healers we are already used to. It's really interesting, obviously, with the new talent system being able to specialize more in one type of heal for one fight and change it up for the next. Preservation also have their own version of Deep Breath, which is pretty much the same, but instead of dealing massive AoE damage, you'll be soaring across the targeted area, healing anyone in it for massive AoE heals. This class is definitely one to look out for in Dragonflight. Being the new class, I would imagine Blizzard is probably going to make it perform very well. As we've seen recently with the recent changes, both the evoker specs are definitely a force to be reckoned with, looking like they could easily end up in any meta comps, whether it's Mythic Plus, and obviously with their utility, they've definitely earned their raid spot as well. Next on my list, we have the Warrior. Warriors are probably the 2nd best class in Dragonflight in my opinion. Warriors are great for solo content, whether it's questing to the new max level of 70 or soloing rares or elites out in the world. You can just drop into protection spec if you aren't already and become pretty much immune to damage while chunking the difficult mobs down that other classes would struggle with. All specs of Warrior are relatively straightforward and they have so much room for changing up your playstyle with all the different talent builds, which makes this class incredibly fun. Warriors bring a lot to the table in the forms of Battle Shout, Rallying Cry, which is the sole reason as to why they're brought to so many raids, even the Race to World Firsts. They have great defensives and survivability, insane burst damage from both the DPS spec, well actually and prot as well at the moment, because Protection Warrior is putting out some crazy numbers, and obviously having the protection spec as well, it obviously gives you the ability to tank if you want to or your group needs it. So we'll start off with the arm spec. This spec has changed quite a bit, but still follows the same principle it always has in huge, chunky, but slower melee swings, dealing crazy burst AoE and great single target damage. Arms now focuses more on sustaining AoE damage as best they can through their bleeds, which are applied via Thunderclap, which is now pretty much baseline for all the warrior specs. So that's a nice little touch for the class fantasy, but Thunderclap now applies rend to 5 targets, so in AoE everything is going to be dotted up with a rend, contributing to that bleed damage. You also have big bleeds in the form of Thunderous Roar, which which is on a minute cooldown and will be dealing some considerable damage. And obviously the main bleed you have being an arms warrior is the deep wounds debuff, and this can be applied by cleave in AoE scenarios. Arms is a much more cyclical playstyle now instead of spamming whirlwind like we've previously been used to. This is because whirlwind is now on a 14-second cooldown, so you want to be cycling through whirlwind, thunderclaps and cleaves. And obviously don't get it twisted, you're still going to be shredding everything up with those big blade storms for unmatched AoE burst. Arms AoE is amazing, and if the boss lives long enough on single target, you'll be executing your way to the top of the meters in no time. Next, for the warrior spec, we have Fury. Fury is more button mashy than ever in Dragonflight, so if that's your playstyle, get involved. With unlimited amounts of offensive cooldowns in the form of Recklessness, Avatar, Ravager, Spear of Bastion, and the famous Odin's Fury return, you will never be in a scenario where you don't have incredible amounts of burst. A true monster in AoE, Fury has one of the best bursts in the game. I've seen players peak at 700k DPS in Mythic Plus. I don't want to get too much into the numbers, but obviously that speaks volumes. But obviously when you're pulling this kind of burst, just be careful of that aggro, because you might end up with a melee swing to the face. Its single target damage is great too, with constant rage being dumped into big rampages, and this spec really feels like you have no global cooldown. In my opinion, it's probably one of the best feeling specs in the game due to how smooth the gameplay is. With the amount of haste that you're sustaining when you're enraged, like I said, you just feel like you have no cooldown. Just make sure you have a warm-up routine for those risks before you log into your Fury Warrior, because playing this spec is an absolute workout, just constantly mashing those buttons. Lastly, for the warrior class, we obviously have the Protection Warrior, which is obviously Warrior's tanking spec. Prot is pretty much immune to damage at this stage of Dragonflight. Previously being the kings of mitigating physical damage, they are now also probably the kings of taking magic damage too. To an extent, from permanent ignore pain uptime and now 100% uptime on shield block as well for those physical damage fights, to spell block and spell reflect now reducing magic damage you take. They really do have an answer for every scenario they find themselves in. They dish out some amazing damage for a tank too, whether it's in a dungeon and you're cleaving everything in sight with huge revenges, or you're soloing out in the world or facing a raid boss and pumping big executes into the mob to chunk it down. Prot really is a complete spec from damage to tankiness. They are a blast to play as well, being one of the highest APM specs in World of Warcraft. You never have a dull moment as you're shielding off attackers and countering with big meaty swings. So if you're looking for a relatively simple spec to play with great results in the form of damage and mitigation in all types of content, including soloing stuff with having access to that tank off spec, Warriors are a great choice for you, and I really couldn't recommend you enough to pick one up for Dragonflight. All this being said though, there is one more class that I believe is better all around for Dragonflight, and that is the Druid. The Druid is obviously the most flexible class in World of Warcraft. You can cover all roles and bases with this class, from tank to healing, from melee DPS to range DPS. You have all bases covered. This alone is a huge reason to play the Druid class. If you're ever bored of one particular role in the game, just swap out, but in exactly the same class you can have a completely different experience in the same content that you want to run. Druid in general brings amazing utility to your group in the forms of stampeding Raw to help those DKs along when they're struggling in the back. They have Vortex and Typhoon to keep those enemies slowed if you need to kite them. In Dragonflight, they now bring Mark of the Wild, which is a huge buff to your raid or party. They have Soothe for enraged mobs. The list really does go on for Druid utility. They have amazing survivability as well. Being a hybrid class, they can chuck out those off heals. They have Bark Skin on a very short cooldown. They have the return of Nature's Vigil, which is actually pumping some big healing. And if you really need it, just drop into bear form and you'll be guaranteed to survive whatever you were scared of. Starting with the Balance Druid, obviously coming into the Dragonflight beta, Balance was doing some incredible numbers, but as of recent, Balance has been at the foot of nerfs. They're still performing decently, and the best part about Balance is their talents seem to be all the best borrowed powers from the previous expansions in the form of Goldrin, which is a personal favourite of mine from Legion. You got Balance of All Things, which we all know how broken that was at the start of Shadowlands, Convoke, Pulsar, which is a shame though that you can't really play Pulsar with Orbital Strike, which is the new Incarn ability, which is going to do a load of upfront damage and also apply Stellar Flare to all those mobs. And you even have the Torghast ability coming back in some form. Every 30th Shooting Star cools down a full moon on your target at 80% power, which feels amazing when you see that crash down on your enemies. It really does seem that the devs took note of all the powers we enjoyed and lumped them together, making the talent tree for Balance one of the most fun in the game. Along with more changes for Balance, you now have more freedom with choosing the eclipse you'd like to stay in. This allows you to optimize more for single target or AoE damage depending on the scenario, and this is even further optimized with different talents. This does take a bit of getting used to though. Being a balanced druid main in previous years, I am so used to alternating the eclipses, and I still find myself doing that now, but obviously that's just going to be the learning curve that we have going into Dragonflight. You can now funnel your damage into single target with priority damage from Star Surge, or we finally have the ability to stack those Starfalls. This is what balance has been missing the whole time. You're constantly generating astral power, especially in AoE, so you can really stack up those Starfalls. I've heard of people getting up to 11 stacks on pre-patch, which is obviously not going to be the case in Dragonflight because we don't have access to the same powers, but that gives you an idea of what we will be able to do in comparison to the one Starfall we've been able to press every 8 seconds this previous expansion. So that really does make up for all the time we couldn't even press the button. This spec will be very hard to contend with in a slightly spread AoE situation. They are really going to be the kings of this, up there with the Affliction Warlocks. They have great burst, great AoE sustained damage, and they are so much more fun to play because of all the changes, so I definitely recommend you to give it a try. Saying that though, just do us a favour and use Glyph of the Stars, please and thank you. Next, we're going to move on to Feral. Feral really surprised me coming into Dragonflight. I'm normally not a fan of the slow energy-based gameplay that they've been subject to in previous years. I can't stand just waiting to spend energy as it slowly creeps up, so I'm glad they finally changed it for Dragonflight. Dragonflight seems to have fixed all the problems with Feral pretty much, and this spec really does feel like one of the most complete in the game, with a good amount of depth but not too much to scare you off. Feral has big AoE spenders in the form of Tear Open Wounds and Primal Wrath. They can funnel big single target damage with huge ferocious bites that are going to do huge damage, and the bleed's constantly ticking, keeping that sustained damage high over the course of any fight. Every single talent feels impactful in the Feral tree, whether you're taking double rakes that also applies a double stun coming from stealth, cleaving your ferocious bites. You can take talents to help with your energy regeneration even more, and just generally focusing more on single target or AoE damage to reach your kitty potential. Feral really did get everything they needed this expansion, and I would love you guys to try it. If you've ever been thinking about trying Feral, now is the time to do it. My only qualm with this spec is staying in cat form for the whole expansion, but I guess that's pretty much the whole fantasy. So 3 for 3 so far with the Druid, as Resto is absolutely ridiculous now too, in both raid and dungeons. Resto is putting out some insane damage numbers too in Mythic Plus. I've seen Resto Druids out DPS me, doing 30k single target. A healer spec doing 30k single target damage is actually wild. I am expecting some sort of adjustments before Dragonflight is released for Resto Druids, but it very well could go under the radar. But yeah, Resto really can do it all. They have great stacked AoE healing, great spread healing with their heal over times. They have some quick instant heals in any spots of bother, though they are not known for their single target healing capability. And to top it off, they obviously have a strong external in the form of Iron Bark, if for whatever reason your tank needs it. And on the contrary to that, if you're in a phase with not much damage to heal, you can drop into cat form and start doing the crazy damage that I was talking about. And finally, for the Druids, we have the Guardian Druid. This Druid spec was a touchy subject to say the least for Druids during this beta phase. From being one of the first talent trees out to being ignored all beta, Guardian Druids were not happy. However, this has all changed recently with some insane buffs to the bear. With 50% buffs pretty much across the board, this spec is an absolute giga chad now, putting out some insane amounts of AoE damage, great defensives, and now great healing too. With changes to talents like After the Wildfire, they're now healing around 60k every 200 rage they spend, which is absolutely cracked, and not to mention that heal can also crit. I could definitely see Guardian Druid taking a little nerf sooner or later to bring it back in line. That being said though, they do still have problems with some of their design and talent trees, but hopefully this gets fixed before the release. However, I'm sure Guardian Druids are a lot happier than before due to the recent buffs. I know I would be. No matter what playstyle you enjoy in regards to the roles in World of Warcraft, Druid has you completely covered from tanking to ranged DPS. The majority of their specs are fun, with some that could use a tiny bit of love, but overall things are looking amazing for the Druid going forward, and that is why it is going to be my best class as we head into Dragonflight. And there we go. This is my opinion on the best classes in Dragonflight in its current state. Let me know in the comments below if you agree, or tell me what you think is the best class in Dragonflight. And don't just tell me your main is the best class. If you enjoyed the video, please feel free to drop a like, sub to your boy, and until next time, peace.